In 1807, President Thomas Jefferson faced a growing crisis. The United States was caught between two of the world's most powerful nations, Britain and France, both of whom were locked in the Napoleonic Wars. Both European powers routinely violated U.S. neutrality by seizing American ships and cargoes, and Britain in particular angered the U.S. by impressing American sailors into the Royal Navy. Jefferson wanted to avoid war, but needed a solution to protect U.S. sovereignty and economic interests. The solution he chose was the Embargo Act, a bold economic sanction that aimed to pressure Britain and France to respect American neutrality by halting all U.S. trade with foreign nations. Instead of achieving its goals, however, the Embargo Act devastated the American economy and became one of the most controversial aspects of Jefferson's entire presidency. The Napoleonic Wars between France and Britain dominated global affairs at the beginning of the 19th century. Both nations sought to control European trade and each imposed restrictions on the other's commerce with little regard for neutral nations like the United States. In 1806, Britain issued the Orders in Council, which required that neutral ships trading with Europe first stop at British ports. Napoleon responded with the Berlin Decree, which declared a blockade of British ports and forbade any neutral country from trading with Britain. These policies put the US in an impossible situation, as American merchants sought to trade with both sides. American ships were routinely seized by both British and the French, but the British practice of impressment, forcing American sailors into the British naval service, particularly outraged the American public and Jefferson's administration. Thomas Jefferson, who had become president in 1801, was committed to avoiding war and believed that the United States could use economic leverage to achieve its goals in foreign policy. Jefferson preferred diplomacy and economic measures over military action, partly due to the country's still developing navy and army, which were not prepared for a full-scale war against a major European power. In response to the increasing harassment of American ships, Jefferson first tried diplomatic protests and negotiations, but these efforts failed to produce results. As tensions mounted, Jefferson began to consider more drastic measures to force Britain and France to respect U.S. neutrality. His administration debated a number of options, including limited trade restrictions or retaliation. But Jefferson ultimately decided to pursue a sweeping embargo that would cut off all American trade with foreign nations. In December 1807, Jefferson urged Congress to pass the Embargo Act, which prohibited American ships from leaving U.S. ports to engage in trade with foreign countries. The act also restricted the export of goods by land to Canada and Spanish Florida, effectively halting all international commerce. Jefferson believed by depriving Britain and France of American goods, the embargo would cripple their economies and force them to reconsider their policies toward neutral nations. The logic behind the embargo was that both European powers relied on American raw materials, particularly foodstuffs and cotton, and that the sudden halt in trade would create an economic pain to bring them to the negotiating table. The Embargo Act had immediate and profound effects, but not the ones Jefferson had anticipated. While Britain and France continued their naval confrontations, they quickly found alternative sources of goods and raw materials. The embargo did little to pressure them into changing their policies, as both nations had vast colonial empires and access to resources from other parts of the world. In contrast, the American economy, which was heavily reliant on international trade, was devastated by the embargo. American ports, especially in New England, which relied on shipping and trade, were hit hard. Merchants found themselves with ships full of goods but no legal way to sell them. Unemployment soared as ship owners, dock workers, and merchants all found their businesses paralyzed. In the South, planters who depended on exporting cotton and tobacco saw their markets disappear. Farmers across the country were unable to sell their produce abroad, leading to an oversupply of goods and falling prices. Smuggling became rampant, particularly along the Canadian border, as desperate merchants tried to evade the embargo and find ways to trade illegally. The embargo sparked widespread political opposition, particularly from the Federalist Party, which was strong in New England and represented the interests of merchants and commercial businesses. Federalists argued that the embargo was too extreme and that it unfairly punished American citizens while doing little to harm Britain or France. Many accused Jefferson of overstepping his constitutional authority by imposing such sweeping restrictions on trade. New England states, whose economies were most dependent on trade, led the charge in opposition. Local governments in these states passed resolutions denouncing the embargo, and some merchants openly defied the law by continuing to trade with foreign markets through smuggling operations. In Congress, the embargo became a central issue, with both Federalists and some Democrat Republicans calling for its repeal. By the end of 1808, Jefferson's administration was facing mounting criticism, and the embargo was increasingly seen as a failed policy. As smuggling grew, Jefferson's administration found it difficult to enforce the embargo, particularly along the northern border with Canada and in its coastal areas where ships could easily slip away under the cover of night. In response, Jefferson and Congress passed additional legislation to strengthen enforcement, including the Enforcement Act of 1809, which gave the government more power to seize ships and punish those caught violating the embargo. However, these measures did little to stop the illegal trade, and in some cases, they only intensified public resentment. Smugglers became more inventive, using remote coves and inlets along the New England coast to evade detection, while some even resorted to bribing customs officials. The growing sense that the government was using heavy-handed tactics to enforce the embargo further alienated many Americans from Jefferson's administration. Despite Jefferson's hopes, the embargo failed to achieve its primary diplomatic goals. Britain, far from being crippled by the loss of American trade, strengthened its economic ties with its colonies in Canada and the West Indies. The Royal Navy maintained its dominance on the seas, and British impressment of American sailors continued unabated. France, under Napoleon Bonaparte, was simply unaffected. Napoleon had already imposed his own continental system, a blockade aimed at cutting off Britain from European trade, so the embargo did little to change his policies toward neutral nations like the US. In fact, Napoleon even praised the embargo as a brilliant move, seeing it as a way to weaken Britain without costing France anything. By early 1809, it was clear that the Embargo Act was a huge failure. The American economy was suffering, diplomatic relations with Britain and France had not improved, and Jefferson's popularity had plummeted. Facing growing pressure from Congress and the public, Jefferson agreed to a compromise. In March 1809, just days before he left office, Congress repealed the Embargo Act and replaced it with the Non-Intercourse Act, which allowed trade with all nations except Britain and France. The new law aimed to maintain pressure on the European powers while relieving some of the economic strain on the US, but it did little to change the overall situation. Jefferson's successor, James Madison, would continue to grapple with the challenges of maintaining American neutrality and protecting US interests, but by 1812, the country would be drawn into a war with Britain, the very conflict Jefferson had hoped to avoid. The Embargo Act of 1807 is widely regarded as one of the biggest failures of the Jefferson presidency. While Jefferson's intentions were clear, he wanted to avoid war and protect American sailors, the execution of the embargo was deeply flawed. The US economy was too dependent on trade, and the embargo caused much more harm to American merchants, farmers, and workers than it ever did to Britain or France. Jefferson's belief that the US could be an economic pressure to influence European power was overly optimistic, as both Britain and France had alternative sources of goods and were not as reliant on American trade as he had thought. In the end, the embargo did not prevent war, it merely delayed it. The War of 1812, which broke out just a few years later, was fought over many of the same issues that the embargo had been seen intended to resolve, particularly British interference with American shipping and the impressment of US sailors. The failure of the embargo also highlighted the limitations of using economic sanctions as a tool of foreign policy. While sanctions can be effective in certain situations, they must be carefully targeted and enforceable, and they should not harm the imposing nation more than the intended targets. The Jefferson Embargo Act of 1807 was a bold but ultimately misguided attempt to protect American interests and avoid war. While Jefferson's desire to use peaceful means to resolve conflicts was admirable, the embargo's devastating impacts on the US economy and its failure to change British or French behavior made it one of the most controversial policies of his presidency. The lessons of the Embargo Act about limits of economic coercion, the importance of understanding the global context, and the dangers of overreaching in foreign policy remain relevant to this day.